What if a man who had built a fortress around his heart was the only one who could save a woman whose world had collapsed into a grave? In the unforgiving heart of the Montana Territory, where the wind howled like a hungry wolf and the snow fell not as a blanket, but as a shroud, such questions were not mere philosophy. They were matters of life and death, carved into the frozen earth by the unforgiving hand of fate. Rowan Blackwood knew the language of the wind. He had lived alone on his mountain for so long that its mournful cry had become the only conversation he held. His heart was a fallow field, salted by a grief so profound it had frozen him from the inside out. He was a man of stone and silence, his past a ghost that walked beside him in the skeletal aspens. On this day, the ghost was screaming. The blizzard was a living thing, a malevolent entity of ice and fury, and it was in the throat of this beast that Rowan heard a sound that did not belong, a sound so faint it was nearly swallowed by the gale. It was a whimper, thin and fragile as a bird's wing. He urged his horse, Atlas, forward, his eyes narrowed against the blinding white. He followed the sound, a strange and unwelcome tug of duty pulling at the threads of his solitude. He found her not in a shelter, but in a mockery of one, a shallow depression, hastily dug, already half filled with drifting snow. From it, a single hand protruded, fingers raw and blue, scratching feebly at the frozen air. He dismounted, his boots sinking deep, his breath a cloud of steam. The cold was a physical blow, but what he saw struck him with a chill far deeper. He dug with his gloved hands, the snow clinging to him like a desperate spirit. He uncovered a face, pale as porcelain, framed by dark hair matted with ice. Her eyes were closed, her lips a faint, tragic blue. She was young, too young for such a desolate end. And as he cleared the snow from her body, he saw the unmistakable swell of her belly beneath the thin, torn fabric of her dress. She was with child. A wave of something hot and fierce, an emotion he hadn't felt in years, surged through him. It was rage. A pure, unadulterated fury at the cruelty of a world that would allow this. Who would do such a thing? Who would bury a pregnant woman alive and leave her for the storm to finish? He gently brushed the snow from her cheek, his touch surprisingly tender for a man whose hands were calloused from axes and reins. Her eyelids fluttered, a barely perceptible movement. A single frozen tear clung to her lashes. He leaned close, his own face raw from the wind, and her lips parted. A name, a whisper of a name, was carried away by the gale, lost almost as soon as it was spoken. But he heard it. He heard the name of the man who had done this, and in that moment, Rowan Blackwood, the hermit of Shadow Mountain, made a choice. He would not let the storm have her. He would not let the ghost of her past claim her. He gathered her into his arms, a fragile burden against his broad chest, and turned his back on the grave she was meant to occupy. The wind screamed its disapproval, but for the first time in a long time, a different voice inside Rowan screamed louder. It was the voice of the man he used to be, a man who protected, a man who cared. And as he carried the unconscious woman towards the distant, flickering promise of his cabin light, he didn't know that he wasn't just saving her life. He was fighting to reclaim his own. The journey back to the cabin was a battle against a merciless god of winter. Each step was a plunge into a freezing white abyss, the wind tearing at them with icy claws. Rowan tucked the woman's head against his shoulder, shielding her face with the bulk of his own body, his jaw set like granite. The weight of her was nothing compared to the weight of the memories she stirred. He remembered another woman, another storm, another life lost to the brutal indifference of nature. The guilt, a constant dull ache in his soul, sharpened now into a piercing blade. This time would be different. It had to be. He kicked open the door to his cabin, and a rush of warm, pine-scented air met them, a stark contrast to the screaming fury outside. The small one-room structure was his fortress, built with his own hands to keep the world out. Now, he had brought the world in. He laid her gently on the cot near the hearth, the only soft place in the entire dwelling. Her breathing was shallow, a faint mist in the cold air. For a moment, he just stood there, a giant of a man rendered helpless, looking at the fragile soul he'd pulled from the jaws of death. The silence of the cabin was profound, broken only by the crackle of the fire and the howl of the wind against the sturdy logs. He moved with a purpose he hadn't felt since before the great emptiness had set in. He stoked the fire until it blazed, casting dancing shadows that made the small space feel both larger and more intimate. He fetched a basin of water, melting snow on the stove, his movements economical and sure. He worked with a quiet intensity, stripping away her frozen, torn dress with as much dignity as he could manage, his gaze averted. He wrapped her in his thickest wool blankets, his rough hands surprisingly gentle as he chafed her frozen feet and hands, trying to coax life back into her limbs. He saw the bruises on her arms, the faint, cruel marks of fingers that had held her down. The rage from before returned, a low, simmering fire in his gut. This was no accident of nature. This was the work of a man, a monster who walked in human skin. He sat in the single wooden chair he owned, watching her, the rifle he'd leaned against the door now resting across his lap. The storm outside was a physical manifestation of the war he felt inside him. He was a man who had chosen isolation as a penance, who believed he deserved the cold and the quiet. But the woman's presence, her sheer, desperate will to live, was a spark in the frozen darkness of his existence. It was a complication he didn't want, a responsibility he hadn't asked for. Yet, as he watched the faint rise and fall of her chest under the heavy blankets, he knew he would not, could not, turn away. He was tethered to her now, by a shared moment of desperation in the heart of a blizzard. The firelight flickered across her pale face, softening the harsh lines of her ordeal. He saw not just a victim, but a fighter, someone whose spirit refused to be extinguished. And Rowan Blackwood, a man who thought he had nothing left to give, felt the first, tentative thaw around the edges of his frozen heart. He was no longer just a man waiting to die. He was a guardian, and he would guard this fragile life with his own. She woke to the smell of wood smoke and brewing coffee, a scent so deeply tied to life and warmth that it felt like a dream. Her body ached with a profound, bone-deep weariness, but she was warm, impossibly, miraculously warm. Her eyes fluttered open, adjusting to the dim, flickering light. She was in a small, rough-hewn room, wrapped in a cocoon of heavy wool. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, a healthy fire crackling within its hearth, its light painting the log walls in shades of orange and gold. A man sat in a chair not far away, his large frame silhouetted against the flames. He was cleaning a rifle, his movements methodical and quiet. Fear, cold and sharp, lanced through her. She tried to sit up, a gasp escaping her lips, as a wave of dizziness washed over her. The man's head snapped up. His eyes, the color of a winter sky, met hers. He wasn't smiling. His face was a landscape of harsh lines and stubbled shadow, a testament to a hard life. He looked severe, almost dangerous. He put the rifle aside and stood, his height filling the small space. He walked to the stove, ladled broth into a wooden bowl, and brought it to her. He didn't speak, just held it out. Liora stared at him, then at the bowl. Steam rose from it, carrying the scent of salt and herbs. Her stomach clenched with a hunger so fierce it was painful. Her hands trembled as she reached for it. He held it steady for her, his large calloused fingers brushing against hers. His touch was firm, not unkind. "Eat," he said. His voice was like stones rolling downhill, deep and rough. It was the first word he'd spoken to her. She did as she was told, sipping the hot broth. It was like pouring life back into her veins. With each spoonful, the fog in her mind cleared a little more, and with the clarity came the memories. The argument. The cold, righteous fury in Jedediah's eyes. His pronouncement that she and the child she carried were an abomination. The blow to her head. The suffocating darkness. The feeling of cold earth being piled on top of her. A sob caught in her throat, and she choked on the broth. The man took the bowl from her trembling hands and set it aside. He didn't say anything, didn't offer platitudes or comfort. He just sat back down in his chair and watched the fire, giving her the space to breathe, to grapple with the terror that was resurfacing. His silence was a strange kind of gift. It wasn't empty. It was solid, patient. It allowed her to feel her own fear without feeling judged by it. After a long while, when her breathing had evened out, she found her voice. It was a raw, cracked whisper. "My name is Liora." He nodded, his gaze still on the fire. Rowan. The name was simple, solid, like the man himself. You found me," she said, the words inadequate. "The storm," he replied, as if that explained everything. But it didn't. It didn't explain why a stranger would brave that monster of a blizzard for her. It didn't explain the warmth of the blankets or the life-giving broth. "He left me there," she whispered, the words tearing at her throat. "Jedediah. He said the snow would purify my sin." Rowan's hands, which had been resting on his knees, clenched into fists. A muscle feathered in his jaw. He didn't look at her, but she felt the change in the room, the air growing tight with a silent, controlled rage. He still didn't speak, but in that moment, Liora knew. She was afraid of Jedediah. She was afraid of the storm. She was afraid of what the future held. But she was not afraid of this quiet, formidable man. For the first time in a very long time, she felt something other than terror. It was a fragile, tentative shoot of something she hadn't dared to feel for months. It was a flicker of safety. Days bled into one another, marked only by the shifting light through the cabin's single, frost-etched window. The blizzard did not relent. It held them captive, a warden made of wind and snow, effectively cutting them off from the rest of the world. In this enforced isolation, a strange and silent rhythm began to form between them. It was a life stripped down to its barest essentials: warmth, food, survival. And in that simplicity, a fragile trust began to grow. Rowan was a man of routines. He would rise before the sun, stoke the fire, and check his snares near the cabin. He moved with a quiet economy, never a wasted motion, his presence as steady and unobtrusive as the mountain he lived on. He rarely spoke, but Liora began to learn his language. A log placed on the fire was a statement of care. A plate of food left on the small table was a question. The sharp, rhythmic crack of his axe splitting firewood outside was a declaration of protection, a sound that became a strange and comforting heartbeat in the desolate quiet. Liora, in turn, began to heal. The deep ache in her bones subsided, replaced by the strength that came from regular meals and uninterrupted rest. The fear, while still a constant companion, receded from a frantic scream to a low, wary hum. She found small ways to contribute, to pull her own weight in their silent partnership. She would mend his torn shirt with a needle and thread from her own small salvaged sewing kit. She kept the cabin tidy, her gentle ordering a stark contrast to its previous Spartan neglect. She learned to read the shift in his shoulders, the tightening of his jaw, the rare moments when the hardness in his eyes would soften as he watched her. She told him more of her story, not all at once, but in fragments, offered up in the quiet evenings as they sat by the fire. She spoke of Jedediah, not her husband, but the town's powerful elder, a man whose piety was a cloak for his cruelty. She had been a widow, working as a housekeeper in his home. He had taken advantage of her vulnerability, and when she found herself with child, his passion turned to puritanical fury. He could not have his reputation tarnished by a bastard child, so he had pronounced his own judgment, dragging her into the wilderness under the guise of sending her away and enacting his own brutal, final solution. He told the town I ran away that I was a fallen woman, she said one evening, her voice barely a whisper, her hands resting protectively on her swollen belly. No one will look for me. They will believe him. He is a man of God. Rowan, who had been sharpening a knife by the firelight, paused. The blade stilled. God has nothing to do with a man like that, he rumbled, his voice low and certain. The words were a lifeline. In a world that had condemned her, this quiet, solitary man had offered not judgment, but validation. He believed her. That simple act of faith was more precious than gold. One afternoon she watched him through the window as he stood in the swirling snow, staring out at the white expanse. His shoulders were slumped, his posture betraying a deep and abiding sorrow that his stern face usually kept hidden. She felt a pang of empathy, a sudden understanding that his fortress of solitude was not built of strength, but of pain. He was as much a prisoner of his past as she was of hers. She saw then that they were two sides of the same coin, two souls scarred by the world, seeking refuge in the same small, warm space. The cabin was no longer just his shelter. It was becoming their sanctuary, a place where the monsters, both outside and in, were held at bay by the simple, unspoken promise of mutual protection. The bond between them deepened, not in grand declarations, but in the spaces between words, in shared glances and quiet acts of service. It was a connection forged in the crucible of their shared isolation, tempered by the heat of the hearth fire. One night, the ghosts of Liora's past came for her in her sleep. She cried out, a muffled, terrified sound, thrashing against the confines of the wool blankets. She was back in the shallow grave, the weight of the snow pressing down, stealing her breath, the cold seeping into her very marrow. Jedediah's face loomed over her, his eyes cold and righteous, whispering of sin and damnation. Suddenly, a firm hand was on her shoulder, and a deep voice cut through the nightmare. Liora, you're safe. Her eyes flew open, wide with lingering terror. Rowan was kneeling by her cot, his large frame blocking out the shadows. The firelight cast his rugged face in tones of amber and bronze, and the severity she had first seen was gone, replaced by a raw, unguarded concern. Tears streamed down her face, hot against her cold skin. I thought he'd found me, she sobbed, her body trembling uncontrollably. He didn't pull away. He didn't shush her or tell her it was just a dream. He simply stayed there, his hand a warm, solid anchor on her shoulder, a silent testament to her safety. He won't find you here, he said, his voice a low rumble of certainty. I won't let him. The trembling slowly subsided under the weight of his promise. She looked at him, truly looked at him, and saw past the gruff exterior to the man beneath. She saw the deep lines of sorrow etched around his eyes and mouth, and a wave of courage, born of a desperate need to connect, washed over her. You lost someone, she said, her voice soft. It wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact, an acknowledgement of their shared language of grief. He flinched, as if she had touched a raw nerve. For a long moment, he said nothing, his gaze dropping to the floorboards. The fire crackled, filling the silence. When he finally spoke, his voice was thick with an old, unhealed pain. My wife, Sarah, and our boy, Thomas. He swallowed hard. A fever in the spring. Took them both in a week. I built this place for them. We were going to... It was going to be a home. He looked around the cabin, at the sturdy walls that had become his prison. After they were gone, it felt empty. So I emptied myself to match it. Liora's heart ached for him, for the scale of his loss. She understood now. His solitude wasn't a choice of misanthropy. It was a memorial. He had hollowed himself out to honor their memory. Without thinking, she reached out and placed her hand over his, the one still resting on her shoulder. His skin was rough and calloused, but warm. It was the first time she had initiated contact, a simple, profound gesture of comfort. He stilled, his gaze lifting to meet hers. In his eyes, she saw the frozen sea of his grief begin to crack. In her eyes, he saw not pity, but understanding. A flicker of something new passed between them. Not romance, not yet, but a deep, resonant empathy. They were no longer just a man and a woman thrown together by circumstance. They were two broken halves of a whole, two survivors who had found in the other's scarred landscape a reflection of their own. The unspoken truth hung in the air between them. They were building something here, in this isolated cabin. Something fragile, something tentative, something that felt, impossibly, like the beginning of a family. The blizzard finally broke. After weeks of relentless fury, the wind quieted its screaming, and the sun, pale and watery, pierced through the clouds, casting a dazzling, blinding glare upon the transformed world. The silence was unnerving, more threatening than the storm's roar. It meant the world, and all its dangers, could move again. It meant they were no longer safe in their isolated bubble. Rowan felt it first, a primal instinct honed by years of solitude. He stood at the door, staring out at the pristine, unbroken expanse of white, a rifle held loosely in his hand. The beauty of the scene was a lie. It was a clean slate on which death could write a new story. Liora came to stand beside him, wrapping a shawl tighter around her shoulders. She too felt the shift in the air, the end of their strange, suspended peace. The baby in her womb kicked, a small, insistent reminder of the life they were protecting. "He'll come, won't he?" she asked, her voice steady, the terror of her nightmares replaced by a grim resolve. Rowan didn't have to ask who he was. He just nodded, his gaze fixed on the distant pass, the only way up or down the mountain. "He's a proud man," Rowan said, his voice a low growl. "He can't abide a loose end." The day passed in a state of high tension. Every snap of a twig, every cry of a bird, sent a jolt of adrenaline through them. Rowan worked methodically, reinforcing the door, checking his ammunition, his face a mask of cold fury. He was no longer just a man protecting a stranger. He was a father protecting his family. He looked at Liora, her belly a proud, defiant sphere of life against the harsh backdrop of the wilderness. And he knew, with a certainty that shook him to his core, that he would die before he let anyone harm her or the child. The next morning, it came. A black speck against the white, moving slowly but surely up the winding trail to the cabin. Then another speck behind it. 2 riders. Rowan's hand tightened on his rifle. "Go to the back," he ordered Liora, his voice devoid of any emotion but command. "Bar the window shutter. Stay down, no matter what you hear." She hesitated, her eyes wide with fear, but also with a fierce, protective light of her own. "Rowan!" He turned to her, and for a second, the mask slipped. He cupped her face in his hand, his thumb stroking her cheek. "I'm not losing another family, Liora. Not this one." The words, raw and honest, hung in the air between them. It was everything he hadn't been able to say, a confession and a vow, all in one. She nodded, her eyes filling with tears she refused to let fall. She squeezed his arm, a silent promise of her own, and retreated to the small root cellar trapdoor at the back of the cabin. Rowan turned back to the door, his heart pounding a slow, heavy drumbeat against his ribs. The ghosts of his past were silent. The emptiness inside him was gone, filled now with a roaring, protective fire. He was not the hollowed-out man he had been. He was a bastion. He was a fortress. And the enemy was at the gate. The riders drew closer, their forms solidifying. One was a broad, thuggish-looking man. The other, dressed in a fine black coat, sat tall and proud in his saddle. Even from a distance, Rowan could feel the venomous aura of piety and possession. It was Jedediah. The final confrontation had arrived. The two riders reined in their horses a stone's throw from the cabin. Jedediah dismounted with a fluid, arrogant grace, his fine leather boots sinking into the pure white snow. He surveyed the rustic cabin with a sneer, as if its very existence were an offence. His hired man, a brute with a mean, pinched face, remained mounted, a shotgun resting across his saddle horn. "Rowan Blackwood," Jedediah called out, his voice smooth and commanding, used to being obeyed. "The hermit of Shadow Mountain. I've come for what is mine. Send out the harlot and the abomination she carries, and I will be merciful." The door to the cabin remained shut. The silence stretched, taut and vibrating. "I know you're in there, Blackwood." Jedediah's voice sharpened, losing its silken edge. "You are harboring a thief and a sinner, a woman who has defied God's law and man's. Give her to me, and the town will hear of your Christian charity. Hide her, and they will hear of your depravity." The cabin door creaked open. Rowan stepped out onto the small porch, his tall frame blocking the entrance. He held his rifle loosely, its barrel pointed at the ground, but his posture was as unyielding as the mountain behind him. "She's not yours," Rowan said, his voice a low rumble that carried easily in the still, cold air. "And this is my land. You are not welcome here." Jedediah laughed, a short, ugly sound. "Your land? This is God's land, and I am his instrument. That woman carries a child of sin, a stain that must be cleansed. You would defy the will of the Almighty for a common whore." Rowan's eyes, cold as glacial ice, narrowed. "The only sin I see here stands before me, wrapped in a preacher's coat." A flash of fury crossed Jedediah's face. His mask of piety slipped, revealing the monster beneath. "You will regret those words, hermit. Kill him!" He spat at his hired man. The brute raised his shotgun, but he never had the chance to fire. Rowan's rifle was up and cracked in a single fluid motion. The shot echoed through the valley like a clap of thunder. The hired man grunted, dropping his weapon as he clutched a sudden blossoming red stain on his shoulder and tumbled from his horse into the snow. Jedediah, stunned for a moment by the sudden violence, drew a pistol from beneath his coat. "You fool! You've sealed your own damnation!" he screamed, firing wildly. Rowan dove back into the cabin as a bullet splintered the doorframe where his head had been. The siege began. Shots were exchanged, the peaceful silence of the mountain shattered by the crack of gunfire. Jedediah used his horse for cover, his voice a constant, venomous stream of curses and scripture, twisted to suit his own dark purpose. Inside, Rowan moved with deadly efficiency, using the small window as a firing port, his jaw set, his mind clear. He was no stranger to violence. He had seen it in the war, and it had haunted him for years. But this was different. This was not a fight for a flag or a piece of land. It was a fight for a future. It was a fight for a family. Suddenly, a scream came from the back of the cabin, a choked, terrified sound. Rowan's blood ran cold. The brute he'd shot, not as wounded as he'd thought, had circled around and broken through the rear shutter. Rowan spun around just as the man lunged for the trapdoor where Liora was hidden. In that split second, Rowan didn't think. He reacted. He dropped his rifle and charged, his body a battering ram of pure protective fury. He slammed into the man, the impact driving them both hard against the log wall. The fight was primal, brutal, a desperate struggle of fists and grunts in the confined space. Just as the brute gained the upper hand, his fingers closing around Rowan's throat, the trapdoor flew open. Liora emerged, her face pale, but her eyes blazing with a warrior's fire. In her hand, she held Rowan's heavy iron skillet. With a cry that was part rage, part terror, she swung it with all her might, connecting with the side of the man's head with a sickening thud. He crumpled to the floor, unconscious. Rowan gasped for air, staring at Liora, who stood over the fallen man, trembling but defiant. In her eyes, he saw not a victim, but an equal, a partner. A roar of fury from outside reminded them Jedediah was still there. Rowan grabbed his rifle, gave Liora a quick, fierce nod of gratitude, and turned back to the front. The fight wasn't over yet. With his hired gun out of commission, Jedediah's tactics grew more desperate. He abandoned his cover, rushing the cabin with a fanatical gleam in his eyes, firing his pistol until it clicked empty. Rowan stood his ground on the porch, a towering, implacable figure. He didn't fire. He let the man come. When Jedediah was mere feet away, he threw the empty pistol at Rowan and drew a long, vicious-looking knife. "I will cut the sin from her myself," he shrieked, his face a mask of madness. He lunged. Rowan met the charge not with a bullet, but with the hard wooden stock of his rifle, swinging it in a powerful arc that caught Jedediah squarely in the chest. The air left Jedediah's lungs in a whoosh, and he staggered back, the knife falling from his grasp. Rowan stepped forward, pressing the barrel of his rifle under Jedediah's chin, forcing his head back. They stood like that for a long, silent moment, the only sounds their harsh breathing and the drip of melting snow from the eaves. "Get off my mountain," Rowan snarled, his voice a low, lethal promise. "If I ever see your face again, I will not be so merciful." Fear, pure and undiluted, finally broke through Jedediah's righteous facade. He saw not a simple hermit, but a man with nothing left to lose and everything to protect. He saw the end of his world in Rowan's cold, unwavering eyes. He scrambled backward, falling in the snow, then Crab walked away before finding his feet and stumbling towards his horse, a pathetic, broken figure. He mounted and fled, not looking back, his black coat a stain against the white snow, shrinking into the distance until he was gone. The silence that fell was absolute. The violence was over, leaving a strange, hollow echo in its wake. Rowan stood for a long time, watching the empty trail, the rifle still in his hands, his body thrumming with adrenaline. The door creaked open behind him. Liora stepped out, her gaze falling on the unconscious brute inside, then on the rapidly disappearing form of Jedediah. Then her eyes locked on Rowan. He turned to face her, and she saw the deep gash on his forearm where Jedediah's knife had grazed him, a wound he hadn't even registered in the heat of the fight. "You're hurt," she breathed, rushing to his side. He looked down at his arm as if noticing it for the first time. "It's nothing." But it was something. It was proof of what he had risked for her, for them. She gently took the rifle from his hands and set it aside. She tore a strip of fabric from her petticoat and began to carefully, tenderly wrap his wound. Her touch was a balm, not just to his skin, but to his soul. They stood on the porch, surrounded by the aftermath of the battle, the pristine snow now trampled and stained. The threat was vanquished, the danger past. All that was left was the two of them. "He's gone," Rowan said, his voice raw. It wasn't a question. It was the closing of a chapter. Liora finished tying the makeshift bandage, and her hands lingered on his arm. She looked up at him, her eyes clear and full of a profound emotion that needed no words. "We're safe," she whispered, and in that simple phrase, a new chapter began. He reached out, his unwounded hand coming up to cup her cheek, his thumb gently stroking her skin. It was a gesture of infinite tenderness, a silent acknowledgement of the bond that had been forged in fire and fear. The fortress around his heart had not just been breached, it had been rebuilt, with her at its center. In that moment, the first sharp pain of labor shot through Liora's body. She gasped, her hand flying to her belly. Rowan's eyes widened, a flicker of panic quickly replaced by that same solid, unwavering resolve. The fight was over, but a new, more profound challenge was just beginning. He swept her up into his arms and carried her back inside. Not to a fortress, but to a home. The seasons turned on Shadow Mountain, painting the landscape in new colors. The violent white of winter gave way to the tender green of spring, which blazed into the golden glory of summer. The cabin, once a monument to loss and solitude, was now filled with a different kind of life. It echoed not with silence, but with the gurgling coos and occasional cries of a baby girl. They named her Sarah Hope. Sarah for the past that was honored but no longer a ghost, and hope for the future they had fought so hard to claim. The child was the heart of their new world, a tiny, perfect fusion of their two broken lives. Rowan, the man of stone, was transformed. The harsh lines on his face were softened by smiles as he watched his daughter grasp his calloused finger with her impossibly small hand. He built her a cradle from the smoothest pine, sanded down until it felt like silk, a task he performed with the reverence of a holy sacrament. He would walk with her in the evenings, her small weight a warm and precious burden in his arms, and point out the deer in the meadow, his deep voice a gentle rumble as he told her the names of the stars. He was no longer a hermit, he was a father. Liora, too, was reborn. The fear that had lived in her eyes for so long was replaced by a serene and powerful confidence. She was the steady, gentle heart of their home. She planted a garden in the rich mountain soil, coaxing life from the earth with a patient hand. Her laughter, a sound Rowan had never expected to hear, became the cabin's most beautiful music. She was no longer a refugee, she was a matriarch. Their love story was not one of grand pronouncements or flowery poems. It was written in the language they had always shared, the language of action. It was in the way he'd bring her a cup of coffee just as she was waking, the way she'd mend the collar of his shirt. It was in a shared look across the dinner table as they watched their daughter smear food on her face. It was in the comfortable silence that settled between them as they sat on the porch in the evenings, watching the sun set behind the peaks, her head resting on his shoulder. One summer afternoon, a travelling preacher, a kind-eyed man with a weathered face, made his way up the mountain, seeking shelter for the night. They welcomed him, sharing their simple meal. He saw the love that filled the small cabin, the profound peace that radiated from the man, the woman, and their child. Before he left the next morning, he joined their hands over the small wooden table. With a simple prayer and a gentle smile, he declared them husband and wife in the eyes of God. It was a quiet ceremony, witnessed only by the mountains and the sky, but it was more binding than any law or document. It was a formal recognition of a truth their hearts had known for months. They were a family, bound not by law or convention, but by a shared history of survival and a profound, abiding love. They had taken the broken pieces of their lives and built something whole, something strong, something beautiful. Years passed, flowing like the clear mountain stream that ran near the cabin. The passage of time was marked by the notches Rowan carved into the doorframe, tracking Sarah Hope's growth. She was a child of the mountain, with her mother's compassionate eyes and her father's quiet strength. She had his dark hair and her mother's ready smile. She could name every wildflower in the meadow and track a rabbit through the woods, with a skill that made Rowan's chest swell with a quiet, fierce pride. The cabin grew with them. Rowan added another room, its windows facing the sunrise. Liora filled it with braided rugs and jars of preserved berries, turning the rugged shelter into a place of warmth and comfort, a true home. Their life was simple, but it was rich. They were self-sufficient, beholden to no one. The town below and the judgment of men like Jedediah was a world away, a half-forgotten bad dream. Their world was the sky, the trees, the changing seasons, and each other. Their love, once a fragile seedling, had grown into a mighty oak, its roots sunk deep into the mountain soil, strong enough to withstand any storm. It was a quiet, steady thing, a love that had been earned, not just found. One crisp autumn evening, Rowan and Liora sat on the porch, watching a 5-year-old Sarah chase fireflies in the twilight, her laughter like tiny bells in the cool air. Liora leaned her head on Rowan's shoulder, his arm wrapping around her with familiar ease. "Do you ever think about him?" she asked softly. Rowan knew who she meant. He looked out at the darkening valley. "Sometimes," he admitted, his voice a low rumble. "I think about the man I was before I found you. Empty, waiting for nothing. You and Sarah, you didn't just save my life, Liora. You gave me one." She squeezed his hand, her heart full. They had found each other in the heart of a blizzard, two souls buried under the snow of their own grief and despair. But from that frozen ground, they had built a sanctuary, a legacy of warmth and love that would outlast the harshest winter. Their story is a testament to the enduring power of the human heart, a reminder that even in the deepest darkness, a single act of kindness can ignite a fire that will light the way home. It shows us that family is not always the one we are born into, but the one we build, the one we fight for, the one we choose. What do you believe is stronger, the cruelty of the world or the resilience of the human spirit? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. And for more stories that inspire and warm the soul, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel. We'll be waiting for you with another tale very soon.